Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Mr. Speaker, it was reported this week, including in the Daily Mail, the BBC and ITV, backed up by numerous sources, that at the end of October, the Prime Minister said he would rather have, and I quote, bodies pile high than implement another lockdown. Can the Prime Minister tell the House categorically, yes or no, did he make those remarks or remarks to that effect?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, and I think the right honourable gentleman is a lawyer, I'm given to understand. I think that if he's going to repeat allegations like that, he should come to this House and substantiate those allegations and say where he heard them and who exactly is supposed to have said those. Who exactly is supposed to have said those things, Mr. Speaker? Because what I certainly can tell him, and he asked about the October decisions, they were very bitter, very difficult decisions, as they would be for any Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, because no one wants to put this country into a lockdown with all the consequences that means for loss of education, for the damage to people's life chances, to the huge medical backlog that it entails. But it was thanks to that lockdown, the tough decision that we took, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the heroic efforts of the British people, that we have got through to this stage in the pandemic where we find ourselves rolling out our vaccine, where we've done 50% of the population, 25% of the adult population have now had 2 doses, Mr. Speaker. And lockdowns are miserable. Lockdowns are appalling things to have to do, but I have to say that I believe that we had absolutely no choice.
Yes, stop.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue, there'll be further on this, believe you me, who initially, and Prime Minister, initially is the key word here, who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to misleading Parliament, he may recollect that it was only a few weeks ago that he said that he didn't oppose this government, this country staying in leaving the European Medicines Agency. In fact, that he was then forced to retract, and leaving the European Medicines Agency was absolutely invaluable for our vaccine rollout. And actually, it was just last week that he said that James Dyson. He said that James Dyson was a personal friend of mine. A fact that James Dyson was corrected in the newspaper this morning. As for the latest stuff that he's bringing up, he should know that I paid for Downing Street refurbishment personally, Mr. Speaker, and I contrast it. Any further declaration that I have to make, I will, if any, I will be advised upon by Lord Guide. But if he talks about housing costs, Mr. Speaker, then the people of this country can make their own decision in just 8 days' time, because on average Labour councils charge you £93 more in Band D, the Conservative councils, and Liberal Democrat councils charge you £120 more. That, I think, is the issue. That, I think, is the issue upon which the British people would like him to focus.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, normally when people don't want to incriminate themselves, they go no comment. Let me ask this. Let's explore this a bit further, Prime Minister. Let's ask it a different way. Either, this is the initial invoice, Prime Minister, initial invoice, either the taxpayer paid the initial invoice, or it was the Conservative Party, or it was a private donor, or it was the Prime Minister. So I'm making it easy for the Prime Minister. It's now multiple choice. There are only 4 options. It should be easier than finding the chatty rat, Mr. Speaker. So I ask the Prime Minister again, who paid the initial invoice, Prime Minister, for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's flat, the initial invoice?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've given him the answer, and the answer is I have covered the costs, and I think most people will find it absolutely bizarre. And of course, there's an electoral commission investigating this, and I can tell him that I've conformed in full with the code of conduct, with ministerial code, and officials have been have been advising me throughout this whole thing. But I think people will think it absolutely bizarre that he is focusing on this issue. When what people want to know is what plans the Labour government might have to improve the life of people in this country. And let me tell you, if he talks about housing again, we're helping people on the house. I'd rather not spend taxpayers' money, by the way, like the last Labour government, who spent £500,000 of taxpayers' money on the Downing Street flat. I'd rather, yes they did, tarting it up. I would much rather help people get on the property ladder, and it's this Conservative government that has built 244,000 homes in the last year, which is a record over 30 years. This is a government that gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, while he continually raises, I think, issues that most people would find irrelevant to their concerns.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of priorities. What's he spending his time doing? This is a Prime Minister who, during the pandemic, was nipping out of meetings to choose wallpaper at £840 a roll. Just last week, he spent his time phoning journalists to moan about his old friend Dominic Cummings. And he's telling the civil service to find out who paid for the redecoration of his flat. The Cabinet Secretary has been asked to investigate who paid for the refurbishments in the flat. Why doesn't the Prime Minister just tell him? That would be the end of the investigation. Mr. Speaker, it's been widely reported that Lord Brownlow, who just happens to have been given a peerage by the Conservative Party, was asked to donate £58,000 to help repay for the cost of this refurbishment. Can the Prime Minister, if he's so keen to answer, confirm, did Lord Brownlow make that payment for that purpose?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've answered this question several times now, and the answer is that I have covered the costs. I have met the requirements that I've been obliged to meet in full. And when it comes to the taxpayer and the costs of Number 10 Downing Street, it was the previous Labour government. I think Tony Blair racked up a bill of £350,000. And I think what the people of this country want to see is minimising taxpayer expense. They want to see a government that's focused on their needs and delivering more homes for the people of this country and cutting council tax, which is what we're doing. And it's on that basis that I think people are going to judge our parties on May the 6th.
Keir Starmer.
Answer the question. That's what the public scream at their televisions every PMQs. Answer the question. The Prime Minister hasn't answered the question. He knows he hasn't answered the question. He never answers the question. The Prime Minister will be aware that he's required to declare any benefits that relate to his political activities, including loans or credit arrangements, within 28 days. 28 days, Prime Minister, yes. He will also know that any donation must be recorded in the register of ministers' interests, and that under the law, any donation of over £500 to a political party must be registered and declared. So the rules are very clear. The Electoral Commission now think that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. That's incredibly serious. Can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he believe that any rules or laws have been broken in relation to the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat?
Prime Minister.
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker. What I believe has been strained to breaking point is the credulity of the public. He has half an hour every week to put serious and sensible questions to me about the state of the pandemic, about the vaccine rollout, about what we're doing to support our NHS, about what we're doing to fight crime, about what we're doing to bounce back from this pandemic, about the economic recovery, about jobs for the people of this country. And he goes on and on, Mr. Speaker, about wallpaper when, as I've told him umpteen times now, I paid for it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I remind the Prime Minister of the Nolan Principles, which are meant to govern the behaviour of those in public office? They're these: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Instead, what do we get from this Prime Minister and this Conservative government? Dodgy contracts, jobs for their mates, and cash for access. And who's at the heart of it? The Prime Minister, Major Sleaze, sitting there. Mr. Speaker, meanwhile, he talks about priorities. Crime is going up. NHS waiting lists are at record levels, and millions of people are worried about their jobs, including Liberty Steel. Mr. Speaker, don't the British people deserve a Prime Minister they can trust and a government that isn't mired in sleaze, cronyism and scandal?
Mr. Speaker, last week he came to this chamber and he attacked me for talking to James Dyson about ventilators, where we're now sending ventilators to help the people of India. And the following day, Mr. Speaker, the Labour front bench said that any Prime Minister in my position would have done exactly the same thing. It wasn't only a few months ago that they were actually attacking Kate Bingham, saying she was a crony when she helped to set up the vaccine task force that delivered millions of vaccines for the people of this country, Mr. Speaker, and helping us to get out of the pandemic. This is a government that is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities. We're rolling out many more nurses, 10,000 more nurses in the NHS now than there were this time last year, 8,771 more police officers on our streets now than there were when I was elected, including tougher sentences, Mr. Speaker, for serious sexual and violent criminals, which he opposed, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on, and by the way, I forgot to mention it. Last night, our friends in the European Union voted to approve our Brexit deal, which he opposed, which enables us not just to take back control of our borders, Mr. Speaker, but to deliver free, which it does, which he fervently opposed, enabling us, amongst other things, to deal with such threats as the European Super League, Mr. Speaker, but it enables us to deliver free ports in places like Teesside, and above all, taking back control of our country has allowed us to deliver the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, as he well knows, Mr. Speaker, which would not have been possible if we'd stayed in the European Medicines Agency, which he voted for. Mr. Speaker, week after week, the people of this country can see the difference between a Labour Party that twists and turns with the wind, that thinks of nothing except playing political games, whereas this party gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, and I hope that people will vote Conservative on May the 6th.
Let's go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition over the humanitarian crisis in India and the injustice over the Horizon issue at the Post Office. Mr. Speaker, over 127,000 people have died from COVID in the United Kingdom. People have lost their mothers and fathers, their grandparents and even their children. NHS staff have given their all, fighting to keep people alive. That's why so many people find the Prime Minister's remark that he would rather let their bodies pile high in their thousands than go into lockdown utterly sickening. The BBC and ITV have multiple sources confirming that this is what the Prime Minister said. People are willing to go under oath, Mr. Speaker, confirming that the Prime Minister said these exact words, under oath, Mr. Speaker. Now, parliamentary rules stop me from saying that the Prime Minister has repeatedly lied to the public over the last week. But can I ask the question, are you a liar, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I leave it to you to judge whether the right honourable gentleman's remarks were in order. But what I will say to him is that...
Say, unfortunately, we're in order, but we're not savoury and not what we would expect.
I'm grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. But what I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that if he is going to relay that kind of quotation, it is up to him in a place like Parliament to produce the author, the person who claims to have heard it, because I can't find them. He says that they're willing to go on oath. Perhaps they're sitting somewhere in this building. I rather doubt it, because I didn't say those words. What I do believe is that a lockdown is a miserable, miserable thing. and I did everything I could to try to protect the British public throughout the pandemic, to protect them from lockdowns, but also to protect them from disease. And he's right to draw attention to the wretched toll that COVID has brought. And we grieve. I know the whole House grieves for every family that has lost a loved one. It has been a horrendous time. But it is thanks to that lockdown and the vaccine rollout, combined with the vaccine rollout, that we're making the progress we are. And I may say we're making progress across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Let's go back to Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, it's the Prime Minister's behaviour which is not in order. This is a Prime Minister who is up to his neck in a swamp of Tory sleaze. We've seen contracts for cronies, texts for tax breaks, and cash for curtains. The Prime Minister has dodged these questions all week, and he's dodged them again today. But these questions simply are not going to go away. So when exactly was money funneled through Tory HQ into his personal bank account? When did he pay back this money? Was it an interest-free loan? And who is the donor or donors who originally funded it? Is the Prime Minister aware that if he continues to fail to answer these questions, that the Electoral Commission has the powers to prosecute him? Will the Prime Minister publish these details today, or is he going to wait until the police come knocking at his door?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I look forward to what the Electoral Commission has to say, but I can tell him that for the rest of it, he's talking complete nonsense. And the only thing I will say is that it is thanks to our investment in policing that we're going to have another 20,000 more officers on the streets of our country, and that is a fantastic thing.
Let's introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. Welcoming Robert Courts, Transport Minister for the Government, Alex Norris, the Shadow Health Minister, and Laura Kuenssberg is here, of course, the BBC's political editor. Well, unsurprisingly, Laura, it was a very uncomfortable Prime Minister's questions again, perhaps even more intensely than last week. He was being attacked over several issues. This, of course, following the news that the Electoral Commission is now going to investigate how the Downing Street flat, number 11, was redecorated and who actually paid for it. But let's return to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader's initial questions, by the end of which Boris Johnson was angry and delivered a somewhat rambling peroration, if you like, in response. And the question to start off with were the words that he was asked about. Did he actually say that he would rather let the bodies pile up high than order another lockdown?
Yes, and those remarks have been very widely reported, including by the BBC. But the Prime Minister repeated his denial, which he did also earlier this week. And just for our viewers, there is also a significance to ministers denying something at the dispatch box, because if you like, that puts it into the official record. And there are strong conventions, of course, about the importance, but almost a sort of sacred nature of what people say at the dispatch box. So it's interesting that he gave such a flat denial in that particular context. But I think it was also very notable just how angry Boris Johnson was at the end of all of that. He did not answer in full the questions about the Downing Street flat, that very clear question, who initially paid the costs. He just repeated the fact that he says he covered the costs himself. But the question that's been at the heart of this throughout is who paid to start with. Was it a Conservative donor? Was it the Conservative Party itself? That's what's at heart here. And he just wouldn't answer it. And by the end, I've never seen Boris Johnson like that at the dispatch box throughout his many, many performances in Parliament, visibly really angry. And his final answer, as you suggested, was a very, very long sort of attempt at a political attack on the Labour Party. But it was quite something. We haven't seen that kind of atmosphere when he's been Prime Minister at the dispatch box before.
Robert, wasn't this the sort of prime opportunity for Boris Johnson to answer some of those clear questions about who paid initially for the Downing Street refurbishment?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been entirely clear that he paid for that wider refurbishment at Number 10. Number 10, of course, being in that unusual position of being both an office and a home. And with regards to the further detail, of course, as we know, there's going to be a number of inquiries into that. We've got the Cabinet Secretary who's been asked to look into it, and he will be reporting in due course. You've also got the Cabinet Office end of year annual reports who'll be looking at that as well. And then, of course, the Prime Minister now has his independent advisor on ministerial interests. So that's where the detail will come. But we can be absolutely clear about one thing, which is the Prime Minister paid for that refurbishment.
But so why won't you just answer the question about who initially paid for it? Why has this come down to semantics? I hear everything that you say, and the Prime Minister too, but it's a very straightforward question to which Boris Johnson obviously knows the answer. Who initially paid for it?
Well, there's a process to be followed in all these things, and as I say, we have that investigation that's being carried out by the Cabinet Secretary.
But why does there need to be an investigation into that? But why does there need to? But why does there need to be an investigation and a review? It's a lot of resources being deployed, isn't it, over something really quite straightforward?
Well, I think in all of these circumstances, there is always a process that has to be followed. I think that's absolutely right. You'll always see such details in particularly the Cabinet Office annual report. You also have, of course, the Cabinet Secretary's report. It's right that that follows the proper course and that you get the details in there. But we can be absolutely clear that the Prime Minister has paid for the work that was undertaken, all that refurbishment work, and what he's doing is concentrating on what really is a massive success story for the country, which is this incredible vaccine rollout, where we're seeing now, 1/3 of the entire adult population have now been vaccinated, about a quarter of the population have had their second jab, and this gives us enormous optimism and hope for the future. It's an incredible success. That's because of the Prime Minister driving this forward. It's achievement.
Right. However hard Robert tries to deflect from the questions about the Downing Street flat law, it's not working, is it?
It's clearly the Prime Minister, I think, is repeatedly going to be asked these questions until he answers it, because there wouldn't normally be a process about these kinds of things. It is, as you say, a straightforward question. Downing Street hasn't wanted to answer it. And lots of our viewers might be wondering, thinking, this is really trivial. This is about who paid for the wallpaper and the rattan and the whatever posh light fittings or whatever were or were not put forward in the renovation of the Downing Street flat. It is the fact that the government has not answered that has sort of created all of this fuss, really. And it's not just the investigations that the Minister mentioned there. Remember, now the Electoral Commission is looking at whether or not an offence has actually been committed here. And I just wonder to the Minister, do you not even find it rather frustrating that you don't have the straight answers either to give to our viewers today, and then everybody could move on?
We can be entirely clear. The thing that really matters is the fact that the Prime Minister paid for those refurbishments, as we've heard. And this has been looked at from a number of angles.
But if there's nothing to hide, Minister, why not just give the full details? If there's nothing to hide about whoever picked up the tab for the wallpaper or whatever it was, why not just give a clear answer, and then everybody could move on? Nobody would have to worry about it. The Electoral Commission wouldn't be having to investigate. Just give the answer if there's nothing to hide.
Because you'll get that answer in due course once the Cabinet Office gives its annual report or the Cabinet Secretary reports. There's a proper process to be followed, and I think it's right that's what we do.
I mean, Alex, isn't that now the situation? I mean, Keir Starmer's put those questions. There is a process. The Electoral Commission is investigating. You shouldn't prejudge the outcome.
No, we've said throughout we just want a clear exposition of the facts, but the reality is we could have had that within the first 45 seconds of Prime Minister's questions, and instead we got a rather evasive and a bit bizarre performance from the Prime Minister, who ended up flapping around, shouting about everything but in an attempt to try and put people off it. This really matters. It matters for two reasons. One, if somebody paid for this upfront, what were they expecting in return? We know that if you used to run a pub near Matt Hancock, then you got good access to getting contracts. What did this person expect if there was someone who did this? And secondly, was this really what the Prime Minister was doing at a time when the UK was heading towards the worst death count in Europe from COVID, and the Prime Minister was panhandling around because John Lewis furniture isn't good enough for him? I think people would find that an extraordinary order of priorities. So I think that's why it's important that we keep talking about it.
Right, but you don't have any evidence, do you, to support those claims as yet? And you say you want to wait for the facts to come out about how and who may have paid initially. But yesterday, Labour said categorically that Boris Johnson had lied about how the refurbishment was paid for. So are you waiting for the results of the inquiry, or are you prejudging it?
Well, look, I'm not going to act as judge, jury and executioner, and we will get that report. As I say, we could have had it, 15 minutes ago. We could have had it a week ago. What we know for sure, because we've been pursuing this for some time, is that the position has changed from the government. At the beginning, they said it was a donor. Then, oh, no, it wasn't a donor. It was the Tory party. Then, oh, no, it was Boris Johnson. So the truth has changed from them. And, so that has definitely happened. And this gets to the very root that they are seeking to evade here. And I think it should be really shocking and really quite something that today the Electoral Commission, they're not just opened an investigation. They have said that there's reasonable grounds to suspect that there may have been an offence. So I think there's reasonable grounds for us to say that there may well have been one too.
Robert?
So look, if we're talking about deflection here, I think what we've seen today at the dispatch box from Labour is a leader that is more lawyer than leader, who has nothing constructive to say about the issues that the country is absolutely facing. Let's not forget about the amount that New Labour spent on that Downing Street flat, which was public money. Let's not forget the fact that Keir Starmer opposed the vaccine task force, and it's that that's led to this incredible rollout of the vaccine that we all have. You have here a Labour leader and a Labour front bench that is just trying to distract from the fact they have no answers to any of the problems that the country faces and no answers whatsoever to any of the issues that we absolutely have to deal with. The Prime Minister is answering and has rolled out the testing regime that's absolutely extraordinary, this incredible vaccine success, and is driving us out of the pandemic.
Alex, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, poor Robert, I know he's got a job to do here, and I know he will have been press ganged into doing it, but these are important matters of public probity. Decency matters in British political life. We know that confidence in politics is low and gets lower by the year. And when people see us just come on and try and throw something else out there to try and distract from the reasonable issue of just asking someone whether or not they paid for works, whether somebody else did, and if so, why they did. That's what really undermines public confidence. Robert, obviously an officer of the court in his time too, I know he wouldn't accept that if we were talking about a Labour leader. So come on, we can all do an awful lot better than this, because people are watching and they think the whole thing's really unseemly.
Right. I mean, can I just get back then to one of the specific questions that was posed, Robert, about the funding around the flat refurbishment, which is, did Lord Brownlow, a donor, make that initial payment?
Well, look, we can only be clear about the things that I've already explained to you. We know that the Prime Minister has paid, and so we can be absolutely clear about that in response to what Alex was saying just now. The Prime Minister has paid.
We've got that. We've got that. Do you think there is any? Do you think there is any room there that somebody else paid earlier on?
So look, you'll get all of the details that have to, the rules have been complied with. You'll get the details in the Cabinet Office report in the fullness of time. The only thing we can be clear about now, and we absolutely can be, is that the Prime Minister paid for that.
OK, so you, like the Prime Minister, when asked, have any rules or laws been broken in the process for funding this refurbishment, he says, no, I don't, and you agree? You're confident no rules have been broken, all the declarations that needed to be made have been made?
I'm quite confident that all the rules have been complied with, yes.
Right. Alex?
Well, the Electoral Commission said they think there's reasonable grounds to suspect an offence has been committed. So I'm going to go with what the Electoral Commission think, rather, frankly, than what Boris Johnson said or Robert said, frankly, because they're the independent arbiter of such matters.
Right. I mean, Laura...
No, we don't prejudge this, though. I mean, investigations happen, and I understand the Electoral Commission are looking into it, but Alex is prejudging it. He very much is. He's assuming that there's been a finding. There hasn't. There is a Cabinet Office investigation from the Cabinet Secretary and the Cabinet Office reports. Yes, the Electoral Commission are looking at it. So it's being looked at from a number of different angles.
But Minister, isn't that exactly what you're doing too? I mean, you've just told us you're confident that nothing's gone wrong and everything's been followed. Alex has said he thinks that something did go wrong, and you're saying to him he shouldn't prejudge it. You've prejudged it. Now, I know in your former life you were a lawyer. Have you actually seen the evidence that makes you feel you're confident that no rules were broken?
Well, you've heard the Prime Minister's explanation of the dispatch box. We can be absolutely clear that he paid for those refurbishments.
In the end, but not initially. Or are you saying you believe that he did pay for it initially?
So clearly you'll have the details in due course from the Cabinet Office reports.
So you don't know that. I just want to be clear about what you're telling our viewers you know and what you do not know.
I don't have any information further than that I've given you, of course not.
Can you take us through some of the timelines on this? Because people may look at it and listen to these conversations and say, it's all about words, it's all about who said what, it's all about different tenses in terms of answering questions. Yes. But it is important.
It's important, if we actually go back to the basic principle, is any politician, particularly ministers, particularly then somebody in such a senior position as the Prime Minister, is meant to declare financial donations or loans, and they can do that in a variety of different ways. We don't have to go through them all. There's a register of MPs' interest, there's ministerial declarations, there's all sorts of different things. But that is a very important principle in this country, that our viewers, the public, have a right to know who has been giving money to politicians. Because what might they expect in return? Is it transparent enough? The reason for it all being out there in the open is in order that everybody can see exactly what's going on, so that politicians are beyond reproach and they can't then be accused of giving favours or any of those kinds of things. Now, in terms of the timeline of this, frankly, Joe, because it's still all quite murky, we can't be quite sure. But essentially what a lot of reporting, particularly by the Daily Mail, has suggested is that shortly after he and his fiancée moved into the Downing Street flat, works and plans were undertaken, but when the bill came in, the Prime Minister at that point didn't have the means to settle it himself. It suggested he went looking for other ways of doing it. The bill was, it's suggested, settled by the Conservative Party or a donor. And then in the end, perhaps even quite recently, the Prime Minister settled the bill. We should say, of course, he denies that anything went wrong, but the reason for our viewers why this matters is because it's about politicians being transparent about donations so that we can know that they're not beholden to anyone. But you can quite understand when it's about wallpaper and cushions that quite a lot of our viewers might think, why is everybody in Westminster getting in such a tangle about this? But it's the principle of who is paying and who is financially supporting our political parties.
And Boris Johnson, of course, and other ministers, including Robert, have said as long as it's not the taxpayer, then perhaps they don't care as much about that issue. But interestingly, referring to your comments about how angry the Prime Minister was at the end of the exchange with Keir Starmer, this tweet from Kate Ferguson at The Sun: Boris Johnson has just arrived in the tea room in Parliament to rally his troops as he faces major questions over the Downing Street flat makeover. He doesn't do that often. There are growing concerns among Tory MPs that it could harm their chances in local election local election rooms next week. I mean, that is quite interesting, isn't it?
It's fascinating because I think clearly at the beginning of, all of this, whether it's the flat or whether it were some of the things that have come out about PPE contracts for people who had links to the Conservatives, Labour has been hammering away at these issues broadly for a long time. Until quite recently, most Conservative MPs or ministers you asked about it said, it's not cutting through. There's quite a sort of feel-good feeling around the vaccine. The government's having a sort of good time. Look at the polls, they're still way ahead, not worried. And also, people kind of know a bit. They quite like the fact that Boris Johnson is someone who maybe doesn't always follow convention as strictly as former Prime Ministers have done. I think that mood has changed in the last 2 to 3 days, if not just because of the sort of laws of political physics. There's always that saying, if something starts going on for too long, 7 days on the front of the newspapers and it starts becoming a problem. We are now, well into a long period of reporting on this. And if the Downing Street strategy is just to stonewall until people get bored, I'm not sure that's going to work out. The Electoral Commission isn't just any old reporter or any old journalist, and it's gone beyond that now.
Is that your strategy, Robert, just to stonewall, or the government strategy just to not answer any question and hope it goes away?
Well, firstly, the point that Laura made just then is I'm afraid, absolutely wrong. I mean, I knock on doors constantly in my own constituency and around the country, and what people are talking about is the success of the vaccine rollout in particular. They recognise the government's had an unprecedented challenge and recognise that it has performed exceptionally well in, for example, creating that testing diagnostic network from nowhere and doing 40% of the entire world's genome sequencing, and crucially, the vaccine success that I referred to just a moment ago. And people, as the local elections are getting closer, are also focusing not only on the fact that Conservative government delivers on its priorities, but so do Conservative councils. That is absolutely what people are talking about on the doors.
That's all, folks.